I think we have quite crossed the time that was given for question answers, and we have taken some of the time that was given by hosts to me to make some concluding remarks from my side. I'll be short in saying few things as to how I look at ground realities and what I see as learning for all of us as academics. I think first thing that is noticeable very clearly here is how most of, in fact, several of the assumptions we have made in international relations as to how sort of interstate relationships are built and conducted stand questioned because of this continuation of Ukraine war beyond 1 year. First of all, I'm not aware of any major expert who had, first of all, anticipated that the power projection that was going on for about 8 months plus would actually end up with an actual hot war. Most people were estimating this is only going to be, sort of muscle flexing and it may not result in an actual war. It did, and it has continued. So, in that sense, that assessment was really misplaced that Russia will not actually go in and fight that war and continue to fight that war for more than a year, which also means that the second component of the same question is assumption that many people made that given the estimates about the strength of Ukraine armed forces, you know, it was not expected to stand up for so long. In fact, Russian estimates, if I'm correct, and Alex can correct me, were to look at 2 weeks' time. And I think President Viktor was already sent to Belarus to walk into Kiev, and regime change was being planned. Security guarantees were being sought from NATO and United States in written format. So that kind of assessment of this war being a short, quick war also were a misplaced assumption. That's my second point. Third, very important element of international relations was understanding that we are no longer in an era where uh, state boundaries could be forcibly changed by any of the states, and therefore there was no possibility of sort of taking over another neighboring state. And we had seen in '91 the Kuwait sort of war in first Persian Gulf War, setting that kind of a understanding that nations can't really take on territories of other nations, and that is something which was over a period of time witnessed changing in Moldova, in Georgia, in Crimea, and now of course in eastern Ukraine. And more interesting because here we are talking of a major power or a nuclear superpower, which takes me to the next lesson, which again is very interesting because it is for the first time, I think almost since Cuban Missile Crisis, that we have a nuclear superpower actually brandishing nuclear threat, going as far as saying that I am not bluffing. Uh, but apparently, it is not showing that impact on NATO because NATO apparently is not just continuing in its both forward and open support in terms of moral and material supplies and support, but also in that sense of actually escalating. Now I sit in Vancouver where Canada is going to supply main battle tanks to Ukraine and maybe other countries, and there's also talk of even fighter jets. Uh, so, in face of a clear expression of nuclear threat, uh, not only the war is not ending, it is actually witnessing an escalation, of course, within the conventional frame of war fighting. So many things that we assumed, were kind of the basis to how we analyzed international relations stand really questioned with the Ukraine war. Another, in fact, final point, a couple of points very quickly. The very institution of war stands completely transformed again. We had seen it transforming over a period of time. And war is, as we all know, is the ultimate tool that a sovereign state has to assert its sovereignty. And destruction is not desirable, but it is still legitimate tool for the sovereign state to use it. And that fundamental tool, ultimate tool of war as an institution is transforming very rapidly. In first Persian Gulf War, I recall at the peak of the deployment, uh, there was 180,000 personnel deployed by what was called private security companies. Now, private security companies obviously are not fighting for the national flag or for the national honor or for patriotism. They're fighting for, checks to be, sort of obtained from sovereign states who are wanting to hire them. And in that sense, the core of war being an activity authorized, authenticated, organized by state and conducted by standing armed forces, uniformed armed forces, began to transform. And Ukraine war, as Dr. Schindler very beautifully brought out, is creating a new genre of volunteers from both sides. Both sides have allowed volunteers, in fact, incentivized volunteers to be given citizenship by these two contending parties in case volunteers come and fight for their cause. And these are volunteers which neither need any authorization, not even authentication as to who they are. I mean, they could just be stateless people. They could be sharpshooters, they could be veterans, they could be, I mean, I'm just intentionally using these words. And therefore, that again changes the nature of war completely. And of course, the kind of continuation of this destruction gradually getting marginalized. I think that's my almost virtually last point I'm making. How Ukraine war, as it enters the second year, has shifted the narrative much more to the uh, global geopolitics of major powers, that being the focus of narratives and debates rather than the miseries and decimation happening on the ground where the war is taking place. And of course, war is not taking place in Russia. War is completely taking place within Ukrainian territory. So that shift of what is the global focus when we are talking of Ukraine war is again shifting very clearly in that sense, and that makes it very unpredictable as to where it is going to end, how it is going to end. Most wars since Second World War, if you have a broad look at history of last 90 plus years, have largely ended in stalemate out of sheer fatigue. And I think is that going to be the fate of this war as well? And in that case, will Moldova, Georgia, Crimea be a model or a clue as to how this war is going to end as well? And if that war comes to an end, what happens to the whole reconstruction of Ukraine? And how do we think of people who have left Ukraine, families that have been separated? I am in Vancouver, and I see several people here in Canada who have come from Ukraine. The whole dislocation that Alex brought about. Russians who have moved out of Ukraine to Russia or to other places, this whole dislocation, refugee problem, and others. So, lingering impacts of that conflict, not anticipating a clear end of that war in terms of a ceasefire and termination, but gradually dissipating and painful sort of lingering impacts of the war over a period of time. And I think there are several similar lessons that one could perhaps then look at, and how the whole equations between China Russia changing, how China is becoming kind of an important player. I remember Dr. Nagao brought out that point in terms of who are likely winners from this war. And I dare say one of the clear winners of this war has been and will be the military industrial complex of advanced industrialized countries. And in that sense, to what extent is the military industrial complex influencing how wars are fought and conducted whenever they are, whether they are in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, or now in Ukraine. So fundamentally, I think this war has a lot to offer to academics or researchers or experts studying security studies, studying war, studying international relations. And in that sense, will be inflection point in many of these considerations. And give me just last 5 to 10 seconds to also say inflection point for India's foreign policy. Being able to sort of muddle through or stay on course with this assertive but proactive neutrality position of sort of balancing between two sides, which is a very difficult act to perform, especially if the crisis continue as long as this has continued. The impact that it is showing on India's G20 presidency, and how hopefully we are looking to some kind of possibility of a final document being sort of clubbed together during the summit meeting. So many of the questions that are thrown up to all of us by this Ukraine war, rather than answers, I think answers are not easy to come by. And that is why I think discussions like these will have to continue. And I look forward to listening to all of you and many other experts on the subject again and again and interact with you, and look forward that we might begin to get some answers that will give us some predictability as to how international relations are going to move in coming times, because uncertainty is definitely uncomfortable. And uncertainties of Ukraine war has created, as we are now saying, shortages and price hikes in food, fuel, fertilizers, and finance capital around the world. That is another kind of disruption that is visible in India's neighborhood, in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. These are large amount of sectors which are getting impacted, both tangible and intangible linkages that the Ukraine war has with life around the world. And I just hope that we begin to not just be aware of interesting questions, but also gradually able to explore and work together in finding some of the answers to these questions. With that, I think I should stop. We have crossed our given time by about 8 or 9 minutes. And with that, thank you, everyone. And I want to also record my appreciation of all the panelists. I'm not sure how we can show our sort of pleasure and respect for all their comments. I can only gesture as if I'm clapping, because if we were meeting face to face, applaud would be sort of showcased by standing ovation to such nice speakers. Thank you very much to each of the speakers, Dr. Nagao, Dr. Parulekar, Dr. Schindler, Dr. Alexander Duchek, and of course to my very dear friend Nalapat, Madhavan Nalapat. I can see Amandeep has found a way of showing the appreciation by clapping on screen. Thank you, Amandeep, for doing that. And with that, I hand it back to Akolkar, Argish Akolkar.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir, for those kind words. Uh, Thank you, respected Professor Swaran Singh, for being the session chair for this session. And further on, I would like to thank all the respected panelists who provided their detailed input and their valuable time. With this, I would also like to thank the audience. And with this, we come to the conclusion of the session. Thank you so much, everybody.